I don't think many of you appreciate just how strange America is to foreigners. Your culture has been spoon-fed to us via sitcoms and Hollywood blockbusters, giving us an apple pie wholesome, saccharine-soaked picture of what life in your country is like. Heroic cops with hearts of gold, harmlessly neurotic couples, friends living in central city apartments while somehow working minimum wage jobs. It's all a comforting fiction that couldn't possibly exist in the real world. Whereas, my first real taste of America was when my mother brought me here in 1996. Within a day, I witnessed a brutal mugging outside a mall, followed by a cop pulling out a pistol and shooting the perp 3 times in the chest. As someone born and raised in Europe, and especially after that day, I would have told you that the biggest culture shock was your nonchalance towards weapons and violence. But as I scratched away at the gun-oiled blue, white, and red surface of the United States, I learned that the true culture shock was to be found elsewhere, specifically in your attitudes on religion. My stepfather had always been a very dominating presence in our lives. Hence, why my mother gave in to his constant badgering to move back home with him to Texas where everything was better. They'd originally met when he was working in Spain on the 1992 Olympics, and he'd flown to London for a conference that my mother was also attending. He was loud, confident, and interesting. A far cry from the quiet, frail man who had fathered me, even quieter and frailer at the end of his life as he succumbed to cancer. Perhaps it was that particular robustness of character and the seemingly indomitable physical presence of this American man that initially attracted my mother. Whatever the case, their romance was as short, explosive, and colorful as the 4th of July, and they married within 2 months of meeting each other. But while my mother saw a bombastic giant with a big heart, and a bigger smile, and a laugh that could fill an empty auditorium, what I saw was an overweight bully with too many teeth and a voice that made my ears ring. That wasn't the only reason why I had very little time for the man. The other reason for my animosity toward him was that his proud evangelical Christian roots were in direct conflict with my homosexuality. Oh, and how he tried to crush that out of me. I grew to loathe the hunting trips, gifts of knives, gun magazines, and soft porn automotive calendars he buried me in. All to try and make me man up. The near constant drone of his soporifically stereotyped, artificially macho drivel became an ugly white noise in the background of my teens. But when my mother was killed in an interstate pileup, everything took a distinct turn, from just plain awful to absolutely fucked. Having legally adopted me, and with my having no living biological parents, my stepfather had full custody. He refused to let me go back to the UK, and instead plunged our dwindling family unit into the heady haze of Southern religious doctrine. Perhaps he saw it as a means to either expunge the guilt he felt at my mother's death, or as a way to come to terms with her loss. Maybe it was just a habitual reflex ingrained in him since he was old enough to be dragged along to church. In any case, it was a miserable time for me. Unable to deny my sexuality any longer, I tearfully told my father, at age 14, that I wasn't attracted to girls, that I only had feelings for boys. I'm sure you can imagine just how well that went down. First was the therapist in his tobacco-stinking office, sitting in a leather armchair under the accusing gaze of a gruesomely crucified Jesus. He strongly advised me to ask God to take these evil impulses from me, lest I burn in the flames of hell for all eternity. Then, it was the intense-eyed, nearly psychotic inter-church faith healers who would lay on hands to pray away the gay, until I wept and cried out as their hard, urgent fingers gouged bruises in my pale flesh. When I confessed to my therapist that none of it worked, he sent me home with an envelope from my stepfather that contained multi-page colorful camp brochure. 3 weeks later, I was shoved into the back of the family sedan along with a hastily packed suitcase and driven halfway across unfamiliar country to a place for boys like me. A place where I would be turned from being a sensitive, effeminate, cocksucking little faggot and instead made me into a strong, God-fearing heterosexual and a healthy American lust for tits and ass. The place was known as Purity Falls. I can't begin to describe how beautifully ugly the place was. Set in a wooded reserve backing onto rocky hills, the camp buildings were a jarring mix. The shining veneer of sturdy polished doors fitted to rough-in log cabins was as wrong as the equally polished smiles from the camp staff and their outdoorsy yet disarmingly clean Boy Scoutish uniforms. The flag of the United States of America flew proudly from the shiny brass pole outside the main lodge, and I wouldn't have been surprised if apple pie was literally being baked somewhere in that postcard setting. But from the moment I clapped eyes on the batons carried by the counselors and the gun at the director's hip, I knew it was a conversion camp. "Welcome to Purity Falls," rasped the director, pumping my stepfather's hand with a finger-breaking handshake. "Your boy's in good hands here. We have a 100% success rate." While my stepfather seemed reassured by the steel in the man's voice, something about it set my teeth on edge. Then, with a perfunctory side hug and an insecure farewell, my father left me in the hands of my new family. So began my stay at Purity Falls. Our day predictably started with enforced prayer, then cold communal showers. I don't think there is anything more confused and miserable on this earth than a bunch of freezing naked pubescent boys battling their newly awakened sexuality, shivering under ice water showers while mad-eyed, uninformed adults scream threatening biblical verses at them. Then it was physical training, mostly running around the wooded hills of Purity Falls, followed by another frigid shower and a massive manly breakfast of steak, bacon, and eggs. Afternoons were spent mostly doing physical labor and camp chores, interspersed with more enforced prayer. Evenings were filled with purity training, which largely consisted of watching badly made VCR tapes designed to brainwash fatigued minds into believing in the doctrine of Christian rebirth. And when someone was deemed purified enough by the staff and the director, they would be taken away by the camp counselors to the cradle of rebirth in the woods near the falls. When the boy came back, he would be docile, compliant, and, exactly as the director claimed, and 100% cured of all homosexual urges. And I believed him. I'd seen one of the boys who came back from the cradle, and the blank intensity of his gaze confirmed that the last vestiges of individuality had finally been strangled from his broken mind. After that, I vowed to avoid the cradle at all costs. During one of our few breaks under the wasp-filled apple trees in the camp orchard, I noticed one of the younger counselors, David, staring off into the distance and mumbling to himself. The other boys took advantage of his inattention to goof off or to try and relax, but my curiosity got the better of me. Creeping closer, I heard the faint words of a song dribble from his lips. "Then sharpen it, dear Henry. Dear Henry, sharpen it." I don't know why I responded, but the words of the song were so familiar that they came unbidden. "But with what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, dear Liza? But with what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza? With what?" David turned to me, his usually blank face a white mask of knowing terror. "Keep singing. While you sing it can't focus, and I'm free of it. Don't stop." As I rushed off the next few stanzas, he babbled at me urgently. "You have got to get out." He took a step forward and grabbed my shoulders painfully, his nails cutting through the thin fabric of my shirt. "If you don't go to the cradle, you'll end up here forever. Like me." "What?" was all I could manage. As I stopped singing, his eyes dulled and went curiously soft and empty before the color returned to his face. "Back to work, fags!" he yelled, shoving me towards the others. After that strained, eerie interlude with David, I learned that not everyone who was deemed pure came back from the cradle and was released. Those who weren't chosen at the cradle, whatever that meant, would stay at the camp until either they eventually did become pure enough, or they became camp staff and stayed on permanently, like David and the other younger counselors. Suffering through yet another degrading, freezing ablution session and another day of this back-breaking labor, my resolve began to crumble. Spending the rest of my life in this place was a prospect that chilled me to my soul, far more than any cold shower. So I started working hard. I sang loudly and fervently at the services in the chapel, and I memorized the Bible with suitable religiousness. I piled my weight and muscle over the next 8 weeks, and eventually, during an evening prayer session where the male counselors bear-hugged us and made us sing psalms until our lungs hurt, I was eventually deemed purified by the camp director. With a gut-rolling mix of terror and abject relief, myself and 2 other boys were dressed in white linen robes, then led from the lodge down the cut stone path to the cradle. The falls themselves were beautiful, cascading vertically from the cliff 40 feet above us and charming the dark plunge pool below. The path, slick with spray, took us around the lip of the pool, then behind the waterfall, where a cavern had formed from erosion long ago. White and green limestone was speckled with quartz and agate, the torches held by the attending staff creating prismatic highlights that scattered throughout the vaulted cavern. The reflected light transformed it from a dark, fearful hole into something desperately and wonderfully glorious. "The cradle," whispered David's awe-filled voice from behind me. In the center of the cathedral-like cavern rose a crown of stalagmites, glistening with a faint moisture from their dripping counterparts high above us. And from a depression in the middle of that curious structure, a white glow began to emanate. 2 of the staff flanked the phenomenon, wildly and ecstatically chanting in something that sounded like, but wasn't quite, Latin. The light brightened until my eyes began to burn, and spidery tingles spread across my body, lifting all the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck. Then, a singing angel rose from the pit, and I fell to my knees unbidden in an uncontrollable act of mindless worship. The being that stood in the center of the cradle seemed to be made almost entirely of light, with a massive silver pale gold and rose wings rippling behind it. Rainbows fired and flared around the crystalline structure of its cathedral, forming a web of shifting, disorienting, kaleidoscopic colors. 2 shining white arms were held up in front as though it were praying devoutly. And somewhere within the dazzling radiance where its head was, I could faintly make out huge luminous eyes. Overcome with religious ecstasy, one of the other boys ran toward the angel, screaming above the ethereal singing, "I am pure! Take me! Oh, please, take me!" What happened next is something I still have difficulty processing. There was a flash of the angel's huge white arms, then the boy was enveloped in the aching glare. The crystalline singing from the being intensified, rhythmically pushing as though to a great, slow heartbeat. There followed a curiously incongruous sound, like a deflating balloon that tore through the cavern. "Rebirth!" screamed the director, spittle flowing freely from his chin. The boy tottered forward from the light of the angel, his now naked body streaked with milky pink-white fluid, and his expression beatifically blank. As the next boy hurried forward and was enveloped by the angel, David began to sing behind me. "Then wedded, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry." With a thrill of awakening, I responded, singing strongly in a sudden panic. "With what shall I wedded, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wedded, dear Liza? With what?" And then suddenly, David darted forward, swinging one of the extendable batons the counselors used to keep us compliant. When it struck the angel, the singing stopped, and with a shriek of alien rage, the illusion shattered. The thing reared hugely and obscenely above us, a segmented and rigid exoskeleton of cerulean chitin, perched upon 4 barbed and multi-jointed legs. A pointed triangular face held scissoring mouth parts still fresh with the blood of the purified boy, and through the pulsing, translucent flesh of its soft underbody I could see the partly devoured remains of a human being. But worse than that was the questing, undulating ovipositor. The tube was pushing a newly formed clone of the most recently devoured boy out of the body of the horrifying insectoid female in front of us. I started screaming. Then the cavern erupted into shouting as the angel speared David through the chest with its barbed forelimbs. Blood rained down on us as the gigantic winged mantis tore his rib cage apart. The director and the other staff lay on the floor now, screaming and clutching their heads, shrieking in concert with the creature as it tried to pull out the baton that jutted from one of its eyes. In a moment of desperate calm and clarity, I walked over to the writhing form of the director, unclipped the pistol from his hip holster, and I began to sing. "There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, a hole." Then I began firing at the head and torso of the giant winged insectoid until the clip was empty. Pink-white ichor covered everything, and the screaming stopped. My father didn't speak to me much after he picked me up from the county police station. I think uncharacteristically keeping quiet and for once not berating me for being a pussy or a faggot was his own way of apologizing. If I were to simply say that the whole Purity Falls incident was just swept under the carpet, I would be doing you a gross literary injustice. The cover-up was so incredibly thorough and well coordinated that it took my breath away. From the memorized stories agreed upon by other parents, to the falsified statements and false evidence planted by the Blackwater Christian cops. I think, in a way, it was an even more terrifying display of the toxic power of evangelical religion, that through their twisted belief system, they actually thought it was more important to ensure that the locals protected one another than it was to tell the truth. In any case, I was banned from ever speaking the name Purity Falls again, on pain of execution. Not that I care anymore, because I just can't get one thing out of my head. What happened to the boys who were birthed by that thing in the cave? What were they? I think they're still out there, walking amongst us, perfectly calm, perfectly compliant, ticking time bombs, just waiting to pupate into so many grotesque angels. Just like the one at Purity Falls.
Number 2.
One summer, when I was a boy, my parents sent me to stay with my grandparents for the break. Raised in the Pacific Northwest, a small town in eastern Mississippi might as well have been an entirely different country for all I was concerned. The instant we got out of the airport, I was struck with the oppressive humidity, and I became convinced right then and there that my parents downright hated me. Of course, the reality was much kinder than that. My parents were good folks, and thankfully I met a girl within a few days of arrival. And we became fast friends. Her name was Jessie, a local girl with long blonde hair and green eyes. The first pair I'd ever encountered. I was in love at first sight. Jessie was a year or two older than me, but that didn't matter much to us. Jessie was the reason I got up every morning. Not in a romantic sense, of course, but a very literal one. Sure, my grandparents were very hospitable, but they were old and southern, about as far removed from my narrow worldview as could be. They just had no idea how to entertain me, and I think Jessie was as much a relief to them as she was to me. Taking me off their hands during the days and curtailing somewhat my boundless youthful energy. The place where my grandparents lived was about a mile out from a place called Ashbury Woods. And it was a mile I walked daily. I would always meet Jessie on the path heading my way. On rare occasion, she would already be at my grandparents' house when I was leaving. And I never saw where she lived. And it didn't matter much to me though, because the woods were our real home. Ashbury Woods wasn't particularly dense, but boy did it seem to go on forever. Jessie showed me a few paths around the woods, unofficial trails to interesting sites like clearings, hollowed out trees, or even just a place where a funny looking bush was growing. We told each other stories of our hometowns, imagining what life would be like if one of us lived where the other did. Whenever we fantasized about having her come live with me, she would get a strange tone in her voice, but I never thought much of it. While the woods were our home and playground, we still set limits for ourselves. If we went too long without seeing something Jessie recognized, we immediately turned around until we were in familiar territory again. She also set boundaries, significant features we shouldn't go past for one reason or another. Decades later, and the only one I can remember is the creek. The creek itself was nothing to be concerned about. It was just a shallow stream of water that may have come up to my waist, with sloped banks on either side that were sheer but not insurmountable. The first time I discovered it, I immediately headed down into the water. Just about ready to cross to the other side when Jessie cried out from behind me, "Stop!" I whirled around on one foot as gracefully as a young boy can, and looked up at her. She stood staring across the creek and out into the woods on the other side. Her hands were balled into fists and kept straight at her sides. And I remember worrying that she might begin crying. I climbed back up to the side of the creek, coming up beside her. "What's wrong?" "We need to turn around." Jessie's voice was barely above a whisper. She looked terrified, and slowly peeled her gaze away from the trees and onto me. "We have to go back." Reluctantly, I agreed, but only because I could see how upset this situation was making her. Like I said, the water itself wasn't that deep or rapid, and it wasn't even that far into the woods. On the walk back, I realized these points, but Jessie stayed quiet, leading me to a small clearing in the trees that we used as a sort of home base for our adventures. Sitting me down, Jessie stared into the grass for a long moment before she spoke. 2 years ago, I had a friend, Emma. Her hands were balled up in her lap, shaking. And one day, just like you and me, we found that crick. I laughed, not because of the content of the story, but because I'd never heard someone pronounce it crick before. Her head snapped up to look me in the eyes, and I fell quiet. Standing across from it was these kids who looked about our age, only they weren't right. That time there was only 2. One of them, his head just hung to the side like this. Jessie let her head flop to the left, hanging limp. Another was real tiny, and his hands and head were even littler, like tinier than a baby's. Now, I'm not proud of this next part, but we weren't exactly sugar and spice to him, if you know what I mean. I shook my head that I did not, and she sighed. We'd call him names, tease him, because they was weird. Emma would throw sticks sometimes, though she couldn't hit the water if she fell out of a boat. This story paused as Jessie smiled to herself, remembering her friend fondly. Did they ever talk back? I asked, bringing her back to reality. Nah, just stood there looking at us, making these weird squeaking noises. Emma and me were starting to call them odd kids, 'cause they were kids and they were sure as shit odd. I blushed at such intense language, but Jessie didn't notice. But no matter what we did to them, they never came across the creek, always just stood on the other side. Staring and squeaking. Wasn't always the two neither. There was different ones, 4 or 5 in all, I think. What happened to Emma? The direction the story was going was obvious, and I was eager to learn. Jessie stayed quiet for a long while, staring into the ground and absently picking at the grass beneath her. So at first we were afraid, right? The odd kids weren't normal, and we would scare each other silly telling stories of how they eat people and like to run around naked together. Just dumb stuff. But as time went on, we got less and less scared of them. It got to the point where we'd stand right on the other side of the creek and dare them to cross over, but they never would. One day we're sitting there talking to ourselves, ignoring the weird-headed ones like he's just another tree, and Emma said something about him being too chicken to cross. We both looked at him, and he just walked off, turned around, and went deeper into the woods, till eventually we couldn't see him, and I teased Emma that he was daring her to follow him. I was listening with rapt attention to this point. To my young mind, this girl's tale of terror more closely resembled a great campfire story, made even better by the fact that it allegedly took place only a brisk walk away from where I sat. Together, the two of us crossed the creek, 'cause, like you said, it ain't that big, and we climbed up onto the other side and chased after him. We went maybe a quarter mile in before we started hearing that squeaking again. Only up close, it didn't sound like squeaking anymore. It sounded like chittering. They surrounded us faster than either of us expected, coming out of trees like ghosts. I was frozen in fear. I couldn't move a muscle, just staring at the odd kids and wondering what was gonna happen. Then one of them, the limp-headed one, he grabbed Emma, and she screamed, and it's like it woke me up. I tore out of there as fast as I could go, practically leaped the creek in a single jump, and ran all the way home. My lungs was on fire by the time I stopped, and I was crying all over the place. People trying to get me to tell them what happened. Her voice trailed off, and I could see tears welling in her eyes. Did you? She shook her head a bit, blinking away the tears. I felt guilty. I felt guilty for leaving her, and I just kept thinking that she'd come home. That she'd be right behind me, and we'd cry about it and never ever cross the damn creek again. But she didn't. She didn't ever come back. Nobody ever went looking for her neither, 'cause she was an orphan. I didn't say nothing, and so nobody even knew to look. Staring out into the woods in the direction of the creek, Jessie's voice cracked. The odd kids got her, and I don't know what they did with her. I'm sorry. I tried consoling her, unsure of what to say, but Jessie wasn't paying attention to me anymore. She stood up, brushing the dirt off her denim shorts, and started walking towards town. I got up and chased after her. "Wait," I cried. "Where are you going?" "Home." "Home? But why?" The concept seemed alien to me. It was in the middle of the day. Who would want to stay indoors? "I can't stay in these woods. Not today. You should go home too. We'll meet up tomorrow morning." But nothing. She stopped and turned to face me. "Go home." Jessie started to turn around again, before something else occurred to her. "And don't ever go across the creek. You hear me?" I nodded silently, and she reached out, grabbing my shoulders and giving me a firm shake. "Say it," she demanded. I promise, no going across the creek," I said timidly. She stared into my eyes, as if searching for my soul for a way to ensure my sincerity. Whether she found it or not, she eventually released me and headed off, leaving me standing alone in the woods, with nothing on my hands but free time and my own thoughts. I looked back in the direction of the creek and the mysterious woods beyond. Was there really such a thing as odd kids? I knew monsters didn't exist in Oregon, but here in Mississippi, it felt like anything could be true. Plus, Jessie had told the story with such conviction that it felt disloyal to be skeptical. I spent the rest of the day in the woods, wandering aimlessly. Part of me wanted to go back to the creek, but real or not, Jessie's story had scared the hell out of me. At one point, I got just close enough that I could make the creek out through the trees, and I peered as hard as I could at the bank on the other side. I wanted to make out a pair of eyes staring back at me, or hear that chittering Jessie had talked about. Heck, at that point I would have accepted a quick blur between the trees as concrete evidence. But despite my willingness to believe, nothing came forward to present itself. The opposite bank was devoid of life, and I didn't have the gall to investigate any closer. As the sky dimmed, I reluctantly began the long walk home, unaccompanied for the first time all summer. I considered Jessie's story of the odd kids, and almost started to get a little angry with her. Of course they didn't exist. She made them up just to mess with me, and threw in another girl, conveniently orphaned, to drive home the scare. I shook my head and laughed, thinking about how gullible I had been. Later at dinner, I ate with the ferocity of an animal. I hadn't realized how hungry I'd become. Alone in the woods all day, thinking. And the chicken my grandmother cooked was the most delicious thing I'd ever eaten. It was only on my third drumstick that I stopped long enough to ask them a question. "Did you guys ever hear of anyone going missing in the woods?" I asked between bites, interrupting the regular mealtime silence. They looked at one another quizzically, as if searching their collective memory. "No, I don't think so," my grandmother eventually said. "Don't ring any bells," her husband agreed. "Why do you ask?" I shook my head, taking another bite to buy myself some time to think of an answer. "Just something I heard some kids talking about," I told them. Some jerks were trying to scare Jessie and me by saying a girl named Emma went missing. Suddenly, my grandmother's eyes lit up with recognition. "You know, I didn't hear nothing about that, but I do recall that girl being terrified of those woods." She nodded thoughtfully over a spoonful of corn. "Yeah, but it was a couple of years back that girl came tearing out of the woods like the devil himself is on her heels. I didn't nose my way into it on account of her father asking people if they'd leave his daughter alone, but I overheard that the girl weren't right for a couple weeks, just sitting in her room and not talking to anybody." She clucked her tongue and took another bite of corn. Lord knows what happened to that girl, but it shook her something fierce. I suddenly felt a sick terror in my stomach. like the feeling you get watching a recording of yourself, only to see something terrifying looming just out of your sight, something you never knew was there. Did this mean the odd kids were real? Had they been watching me as I stepped into the creek? So you never found out what happened? I hesitantly asked, unsure if I wanted the answer. Grandma just shook her head, and the three of us continued eating in silence. Grandpa brought up a baseball game he'd seen on TV earlier that day, and I feigned interest as well as I could, but I wasn't all there. My mind was back in the woods, at that creek, inspecting every square inch of my memory for a sign of something else. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and when it did, it was wrought with nightmares. Thoughts of the odd kids crawled through my mind, bringing me back to the creek, looking deeper into the woods. I saw dozens of pairs of eyes staring back at me, slowly bobbing back and forth as though they were advancing towards me. My dream self was paralyzed, helpless to do anything but watch as the monsters came out of the shadows. The one Jesse had described, with his head sagging to the side, led the plunging advance. As a group, the odd kids crawled down into the creek, dragging broken limbs and torn flesh behind them, each of them chittering off tempo with the others to create a horrible cacophony of noise that filled my ears and bore into my soul, staring into the hungry eyes of the limp-headed leader as he reached out to drag me down. I awoke screaming. The noise still rang in my ears, coupled with my panic, caused me to flail against my blankets as though they were trying to engulf me. I fell onto the floor with a hard thud, finally coming to rest. My grandfather burst into the room, and my grandmother was close behind him. He bellowed, still full of adrenaline even though he was beginning to realize there was no threat. Embarrassed, I kicked the sheets off of me and stood up. "Yeah, just a bad dream," I muttered. As I came to my senses, I realized the noise I had been hearing was the sound of cicadas filling the room, broadcasting their mating calls to the world. Laughing off their overzealous response, my grandparents led me downstairs for breakfast, which I accepted readily. That morning, I walked all the way to the woods without running into Jessie. I stood at the edge of the path, looking back down the road, trying to make out her figure, but nobody was there. Sighing, I walked all the way back to my house and then down to the woods again. There was no sign of her. My adolescent mind filled once more with the nightmarish imagery, but I did my best to stay grounded in reality. She was the last person who would have gone across the creek, and if the odd kids ever ventured out of the woods, surely people around town would talk about them, right? Armed with these rationalizations, I decided to head to our favorite clearing and wait for her. She wasn't there when I arrived. Part of me had expected her to be waiting in the grass, ready to laugh in my face when she learned how I'd walked up and down the path 2 more times before thinking to check our spot. And as an hour slowly ticked by, I began to wonder if something bad really happened to her. But if something had, what was I going to do about it? I had no idea where she lived, and she was the only kid I knew in the area. Almost unconsciously, I began to head towards the creek. I had only promised I wouldn't cross it after all, and if she was so concerned about my whereabouts, she should have let me know where she was going to be. Besides, if she had been able to outpace the odd kids when they were right beside her, I would be able to get away long before they got close. My legs were filled with a giddy, nervous energy as I was walking. Sometimes at a quick pace, and others at barely a shuffle. Once the creek itself was in view, I began to move from tree to tree, using them like cover from whatever might lurk on the other side of the creek. I inched closer, cautious to not disturb even a single twig in my approach. Finally, I was only a few yards from the near bank of the creek. I crouched down and quietly got to my hands and knees, closing the last stretch on all fours and keeping a close watch on the trees ahead of me. I hissed out Jesse's name in a low voice, straining my ears into the woods to catch anything of interest, but nothing happened. It was just another ordinary day, and I was just some weird little boy whispering into the forest. I was just about to turn around when a brief flash of movement caught my eye. I had noticed it before because I was scanning the ground, but turning my eyes up, I saw a silhouette of something I couldn't quite make out. It swayed gently in the breeze, as though it was suspended from the branches. The leaves broke up the distant form, which must have been several dozens of feet away, and I immediately forgot my promise to Jesse. I had to know what that thing was. Just as I was about to swing my legs down the bank of the creek, a call startled me to my feet in an instant. "What are you doing?" Jessie was standing a ways behind me, clinging onto a tree as though she might fall without its support. Though her tone was one of anger, her face was ghost white. She beckoned me towards her, clearly unwilling to go closer to the creek than she was. I twisted my body around, raising an arm to point at the thing I had seen in the treetops, but I couldn't relocate it. I saw something," I said, scanning the leaves for the swaying form. "And with any luck, it didn't see you," she hissed, stamping her foot in the dirt. I shook my head, my boyish curiosity trumping her obvious fear. "Don't be such a scaredy cat," I said. "Don't be such a scaredy cat," I said, crouching down to see if I could find the figure in the branches. Briefly, I wondered if it had moved, but that seemed impossible. Whatever it wasn't animate. "I'm going to cross." "No!" Jessie screamed, lunging towards me. I was already startled by her cry, and mid-turn she collided into me at full force, sending us both tumbling down the bank and into the creek. We yelled and flailed as we fell, both of us landing on my back. The muddy water babbled over us, and I scooted away, pulling myself onto the far bank of the creek. Jessie followed, more out of a desire to get out of the water than anything. "Nice going," I said sarcastically. The water was actually a little refreshing in the summertime heat, but we knew that before long we'd be drowning in humidity, our damp clothes suffocating what little comfort sweating brought. I crawled up onto the opposite side of the creek, once again, raising my eyes to the branches to find what I'd seen. Please, can we go?" Jessie was at my side, clutching my arm despite the fact that I was a good half-foot shorter than she was. "We really need to go, please." "Come on, just a little bit further." Wonder and excitement had overtaken all other emotions in my mind. Before, when the creek was just a memory, it was easy to picture a world of monsters lurking just across the way. Now that I was here, in the light of day, I felt empowered. I could see that there weren't monsters, so obviously I was safe. I'm lucky to be alive. Tugging Jessie forward, I walked to the spot where I had seen the thing hanging from the trees. But now, it was nowhere to be found. From where I was standing, I could still make out the creek, and I tried to imagine myself crouched low on the other side, looking up into the branches. The wind blew lazily through the leaves, shaking them this way and that, but nothing unnatural hung from the canopy. "I saw something right here," I said aloud, justifying my persistence to Jessie. I did feel bad for dragging her somewhere she obviously didn't want to be, and I thought if I'd had something to show for it, maybe she would have understood. Instead, here I was, staring up into the trees like an idiot with a terrified girl clinging to my side. Her eyes darted back and forth across the tree line, as if waiting for something to suddenly appear and attack us. Unwilling to leave empty-handed, I coaxed us slowly forward. As we pressed on, the woods around us seemed to get quieter, as if we were entering some sort of dead zone in the forest, a place where even the birds and critters refused to go. Jessie's nails dug into my arm, but she stayed right by my side, no longer making any noise except a small whimper with every exhalation. After another 5 or 10 minutes of walking, we came across a rocky outcropping jutting out of the ground, and a small hole leading down. Intrigued as I was by the promise of more adventure, something else caught our attention. A strange doll laid propped against the mouth of the cave, facing us. Its elongated forehead drooped slightly over its face, making the upper right side of its head concave. Its eyes were small and beady and black, shining in the midday sun, and tufts of hair had been placed into its scalp in a disorganized manner. It was garbed only in small denim overalls covering grungy cloth skin. Before I could even draw breath to comment on it, Jessie was fiercely tugging me away. "That's it! That's one of them!" She was practically screaming, raw terror coming through in her voice, but her reaction was scaring me more than the object itself. That was an odd kid, an oversized doll? "Calm down," I said, tugging back against her. "It can't be. Look at it. It's not breathing. It's just a doll." Wrenching my arm out of her grip, Jessie fell face first in the dirt, but was on her feet a second later. I heard her start to run and turned to tell her that she didn't have to get any closer if she was scared, that I would go examine it alone. As I stared in her direction, however, my voice caught in my throat. Standing where Jessie and I had been 20 seconds ago was another doll. Only this one was different. It was cleaner and more well made, as if whoever made the one by the cave had learned from their mistakes. This girl doll was standing beside a tree, watching us with those same all-black eyes. Short brown hair matted with dirt and clumped to her head haphazardly. A tattered red dress clung desperately to her right shoulder. The skin looked much cleaner than the others, much more real. Before I could say a word, Jessie broke the silence. I expected her to shriek, but instead what came out of her mouth was barely above a whisper. "Emma?" The girl doll took a step forward, and my terror levels shot up to their limits. I glanced backward to see that the other doll was pulling itself to its feet, awkwardly shambling towards us. Any doubt I had in Jessie's story evaporated in an instant. The odd kids were real, and they were right in front of me. Without another moment's hesitation, I grabbed Jessie's wrist, suddenly becoming the one desperate to get us out. Come on, let's go." I yelled at her, but she didn't even seem to hear me. She instead began to walk toward the dolls. Towards Emma, I guess, though I couldn't see how that could have ever been Jessie's friend. I kept pulling at her arm, even as the thing behind her got closer. Jessie was focused exclusively on the other girl, blocking out the whole rest of the world. The doll reached out to Jessie, and she raised her own hand out as well. "Jess," I began to say, but I was interrupted by a heavy object falling directly into my best friend, sending her crumpling into the dirt. On top of her was a small human-like figure with the head and hands proportionally much smaller than they should have been. Finally observing one up close, I realized their skin wasn't just dirty cloth. It was rotted flesh. I scrambled backwards as the little creature gripped Jessie by the hair, tugging her up painfully. Jessie screamed and clawed at the ground, trying to shove the thing off of her, but the creature she'd call Emma sagged to its knees, clamped a hand over her mouth, and then turned its head to look at me. Energy surged to my legs and I shot upright. I was in full panic mode, operating on a primal instinct to flee, but just as I started to run, I collided into a solid force that knocked me down to the ground. another one of those things stood before me, his head flopping awkwardly to the left, just as Jesse had demonstrated. The one I had seen slumped by the cave came into my view, holding a large rock in its hands. Before I could roll out of the way, weight came down on my head, sending a splitting pain through my skull. My vision went white, and a deafening ringing filled my ears, but I stayed conscious throughout. I could faintly feel things tugging at me, pulling me across the ground as I struggled just to regain my senses. The blinding white slowly faded to an impenetrable black, and the ringing dulled to a formless shuffling, and the odd kid's strange chitters echoing off the walls of the cave. I did my best to stay limp as I was dragged across rough stone, tearing into my shirt and cutting my flesh. I'm certain I whimpered in pain, but the odd kids didn't react to it, hauling me further into their lair. Eventually the motion came to an end. I was propped against a rough stone wall, and even in the darkness, I could tell that one of them was just in front of my face, quietly muttering to itself in those strange, arrhythmic noises. Its coarse fingers grabbed my hands, and it began stretching a strong, thin fabric around my wrists, binding them together. It wrapped for what felt like ages until it finally seemed satisfied that my hands weren't going anywhere, then moved onto my ankles to do the same. Once that was done, the thing shuffled away, the noise of its movements getting gradually fainter before disappearing altogether. Meaning to breathe a sigh of relief, I instead let out a choked sob, finally letting myself express the terror I had felt through the whole ordeal. I'm not ashamed to admit that I sat in the cave and cried, certain I'd never see my parents or grandparents ever again. Only when I heard more movement coming my way did I make an effort to quiet myself. I did my best to control my breathing, sucking in breaths through shuddering gasps and letting them out slowly through my nose. I tried to picture what the noises were. Slowly, I put together that someone else was being dragged down the same rough path I had been. They were bringing Jesse back here too. For a brief moment, I felt hope. As selfish as it is to admit, at the very least, I took comfort in knowing that I wouldn't have to suffer alone. Part of me even entertained the notion that perhaps Jesse and I could escape this cave and never, ever come back to these awful woods again. Of course, the reality of this plan had many obstacles. The cave was dark, something that didn't seem to affect the odd kids one bit. For all I knew, there was one sitting in the room with me, silently watching me and waiting for me to make a move so it could pounce on me and finish the job. On top of that, they easily outnumbered us. The odds were stacked against us in every conceivable way. Jessie noisily entered the room in which I was kept, and her muffled screaming gave me a sense of dimensions of the room. It seemed smaller than I expected, likely only a little bigger than my own bedroom. Still, it was plenty big for storing the two of us. Just as I was wondering if they would leave Jesse and me alone, the room was filled with a soft blue luminescence. One of the odd kids, I couldn't tell which with their back turned to me, was brushing their fingers against a strange kind of moss on the far wall, and the agitation sparked a chain reaction across the entire plant. Tendrils of blue light arced over the wall in a brilliant pattern, the illumination branching off itself like a snowflake before finally filling in, covering the cave wall in the most beautiful display I'd ever seen. And there, in front of the glowing moss, was Jessie. She had been laid out on an obviously man-made dirt platform, and her struggle stilled as puffs of spore from the glowing moss fell onto her. The odd kid stood over her, observing for a moment, before bending forward over her. In my life, I had never heard the sound of flesh tearing, but the very first time was unmistakable. I jerked at the noise as if it had been my own skin, and my heart beat so fast I worried that it would give me away. I screwed my eyes shut and just listened as the odd kids did God knows what to my helpless friend only a few feet away from my face. Mustering up what courage I had, I began to work the bonds around my wrists against the jagged rock, working just slow enough not to make too much noise. The ripping noise soon gave way to gurgles and wet swishing, but I didn't allow myself to picture it. Instead, I thought about my grandparents, about seeing their warm smiles one more time. I thought about the plane that would take me out of Mississippi, and I thought of every excuse I would ever use for the rest of my life to keep from getting on another plane back. I had to survive this. I had to. Sure enough, the ropes came free with enough effort. Once they were weak enough, I managed to pull them apart with brute strength, the fibers tearing away from each other with a soft sound. Something that was almost pleasing contrasted against the disturbing noises coming from across the room. I groped around in the near dark, my fingers moving from rock to rock until I found something loose enough and big enough that I felt comfortable with it. I now stared directly at the odd kid, its back still turned as it performed its macabre ritual on my friend. Sawing the rock across the ropes around my ankles, I worked my nerve up to what I was going to have to do next. Armed with a rock, I was going to attack the odd kid, knocking them out with one good blow. Fair play, I thought to myself. Next, I would grab Jessie and hoist her over my shoulder. She was taller than me, sure, but I wasn't a weak kid. After that, we would sneak out of the cave somehow, then sprint back to my grandparents' house and be safe. The wraps across my ankles fell away, and I slowly stretched my legs out before getting them underneath me. The odd kid was still oblivious to me, and part of me hated that. Here I was, about to bash in its skull with a rock, and it didn't even consider me enough of a threat to turn around and check on me. "Hey," I whispered, the rock clutched tight in my fist as I held it out to the side behind my head. The odd kid finally swiveled around, and I stared into its soulless black eyes one last time before bringing the weapon across. The sensation was nothing like I expected. Instead of a solid blow and a resonating rock, my hand squelched through its blotchy skin with little resistance. I stood there, stunned, and staring into its remaining eyes as its face hung loosely around my wrist. Soft scratches made their way across my hand, and I jerked it back, the force of my fist pulling out of its head, tearing another gouge through the skin that was not skin. Looking down at my hand, I saw the single most horrific thing I have seen in my life. Instead of brains, blood, and gore covering my hand, there were bugs, centipedes, spiders, ants, and more. Too numerous to count, swarmed over my skin. The bag of flesh before me slumped to its knees before kneeling over, its occupants surging out of the black hole in its neck. I lost it. I screamed at the top of my lungs, and I beat my arm against the wall of the cave, sloughing off the vermin and sheets. Through the chaos, I called out Jessie's name, forgetting at the time that I had already expected her to be unconscious at best. Her head tilted to the side, and she raised herself up onto her elbows, staring at me. My heart swelled, thinking for a moment that if nothing else, at least we would get out of this alive. When the azure glow of the moss reflected off Jessie's black eyes, I ran. Through the darkness, I ran, heedless of the frantic chittering that echoed off the stone all around me. I ran into every single twist and turn in those tight tunnels, still struggling to scrape all the bugs off my arm. With every passing moment, I expected to feel the odd kid's hand wrapped around my legs, drag me back to the room, and do to me what they'd done to Jessie. Turn me into one of them. Finally, I saw a thin shaft of light at the end of the darkness. I made my way out of the cave and into the open woods, the full moon giving me plenty of illumination to find my way. Through the entire sprint, I tore at the flesh of my arm with my fingernails, scraping off the remains of the odd kids as they wriggled and crawled across me. The entire run is mostly a blur now. Didn't even peek behind me for fear of seeing those things one more time. When I burst into my grandparents' house, the two of them were both still awake, sitting up in the living room waiting for me. I must have told a tale with a single look, because their stern expressions melted upon seeing my eyes, and they stayed up with me the rest of the night. Sitting on the couch and wrapped in a blanket, I just stared out the window at the dusty road that led from the house, praying that I wouldn't see Jesse walking down it. The next day, after I'd slept and eaten, my grandparents tried to coax out of me what happened. I didn't know what to tell them. Eventually, I told them that I'd just fallen asleep in the woods and had a nightmare, freaked myself out and ran home crying. They hugged me and laughed gently, and my grandma said I should call ahead the next time I'm going to worry them half to death. I smiled, and Jesse's face appeared in my mind's eye. I didn't let myself be alone for the rest of the vacation. This meant staying indoors for the most part, something I was more than fine with. When word got out that Jesse hadn't been home in a few days, and people started searching, my grandparents asked me if I knew anything about it. I wanted to tell them about the odd kids. I should have said something. I know that now. But like the scared child I was, I just said I didn't, and they left it at that. 3 weeks later, I got on a plane and went home, and for the first time since the cave, I felt like I could breathe again. I no longer had the threat of the odd kids looming over me, just waiting for a moment's lapse in readiness so they could pounce. I'd like to say that I don't know what happened to Jessie, that her fate remains a mystery, but that would be the coward's way out. Jessie died because of me, because of my hubris, my curiosity, and my stupid thirst for adventure. Jessie lost her life. This is something I think about every day, even some 30 years later, and it hurts just as much as the first time I realized it. Thousands of miles and a couple decades now lay between me and the worst summer of my life, but it isn't perspective that's prompted me to finally write out my tale. My daughter Maggie has been getting excited about collecting bugs, and as uneasy as it makes me, I'm not the kind to stop her. What really unsettles me about it is how her bugs act. Every time she brings me one of her little jars, the bugs inside, they watch me. I don't know how crazy this sounds. I know bugs don't see like you and I, but it's like they want to know me, like they know that I'm there. I went into my daughter's room a few days ago when she was out of school. I picked up her ant farm to see what would happen. I expected them to freeze, to turn and look at me, but instead they went into a frenzy. Every last ant swarmed to the side of the container, crawling over each other and climbing against the plastic that separated them from my hand. The hand the bugs were on for minutes as I stumbled blindly through the cave, frantically clawing them off. I watched, horrified, as the ants literally tore each other apart to be the one closest to my hand. What did the odd kids do to me?
Number 3.
Alright, just about every 90s kid loved Rugrats. But what if I told you the Rugrats were really a figment of Angelica's imagination? Chucky died a long time ago along with his mother. That's why Chaz is a nervous wreck all the time. Tommy was a stillborn. That's why Stu was constantly in the basement making toys for the son who never had a chance to live. The DeVilles had an abortion. Angelica couldn't figure out whether it would be a boy or a girl, thus creating the twins. As for All Grown Up, Angelica was a bipolar schizophrenic who as a teenager became addicted to various narcotics, bringing her back to her childhood, thus creating a world in her mind that she obsessed over. Because of the time lapse between the present and the last time she interacted with her imaginary world, she made them older. Angelica was constantly taking hits of acid so she would never have to live without her creations. To her, her creations were her only company in a judgmental world. Angelica's mother actually died of a heroin overdose. Angelica was schizophrenic and bipolar because she was a crack baby. Additionally, Drew, in his depression, married a gold-digging whore that Angelica idolized because she fooled herself into thinking it was her real mom. However, she always had a concept of her mom, Cynthia. She used a Barbie doll to mirror her birth mother's image, wearing an unwashed orange dress and jacked up hair, which is why she was so attached to it. Later in life, she followed in her mother's footsteps, dying of an overdose at age 13, when All Grown Up was cancelled. However, the only Rugrat to not be fictional was unborn Tommy's brother, Dill. Angelica didn't know the difference between Dill and her creations. Dill didn't follow her commands, and after endless crying and a refusal to disappear like the others did when Angelica was angry with them, she hit him. After she hit him, he screamed a screeching tune, and Stu ran in and pulled his niece off of his only child. But it was too late. Dill had a brain hemorrhage which resulted in a deformation. As he grew up, his damage only became more evident, and by the time he was 9 and all grown up, he lived as an outcast, being ridiculed for his weirdness and retardation. The immense guilt over this is what caused Angelica to start using drugs and to uncreate the Rugrats briefly, until her experience with hallucinogenics. Chaz lost his mind after the death of his first wife and was in denial that she was ever a prostitute. On a trip to Paris to find love, Chaz fell in love with a hooker named Kira. He was originally going to marry a different hooker, but she just wanted him for his money. Kira once had a daughter named Kimmy, but the baby was torn from her by law due to her cocaine addiction. Angelica imagined Kimmy from Kira's stories. Upon return to America, Chaz and Kira married, and she got her green card. It was a surprisingly happy and romantic story. Kira continually struggled with addiction, but she was relatively happy with her new life with Chaz. Susie was Angelica's only friend, who entertained the thought of Angelica's creations because they seemed to make her happy. She later became a psychologist and teamed up with Nickelodeon to make the Rugrats. When Angelica died of the overdose, Susie helped arrange her funeral. Because of her addictions and her mental state, Angelica was expelled from society, which led to a break with reality and her eventual death. She spent the last days of her life in the back of the school cafeteria, imagining friends around her and playing with the lives of her creations.
Number 4.
You know, parents are always finding new ways to entertain or enrich their kids. In fact, the earliest years are the most important in a child's life when it comes to developing their young mind. This was no different for me. My mom would always take me to the arcades, complete with all sorts of top-of-the-line games, or the parks, with the jungle gyms that were always scalding hot from being in the sun all day. There weren't too many options to choose from, but what they were, those were what made my fondest childhood memories. As a treat for my 7th birthday, my mom took me to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. It was supposed to be a fun little place, from what I can remember, a magical place for kids and grown-ups alike, where fantasy and fun come to life. Or something like that. It looked really promising. To be honest with you, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't excited about going there. The pizza was what you'd expect, lazily put together and didn't quite taste right. But you didn't go for the food. You went to see Freddy Fazbear and his gang of colorful friends. Bonnie the Bunny and Chica the Chick. There was Foxy too, he lived in the Pirate Cove. Thinking back on it now, the animatronics were pretty good for the time. They had full body movements when singing on stage, and even Foxy moved around quite a bit on his little pirate ship. In fact, I remember that after a few songs, Freddy and friends would come off the stage and walk around, interacting with the kids. They would walk up to the kids and say things like, "How's the pizza? Good, I bet." Or, "Are you having fun? I know I am." I remember the fox always said, "It's me, I'm gonna get you." It was so cute. To keep the kids entertained, there would be little games they'd play like Follow the Freddy, which was just follow the leader, or Foxy's Treasure Hunt, where kids would be given small trinkets and Foxy would chase after them, like a game of tag. I remember I had finished my slice of pizza, and I asked if I could play the treasure hunt game with Foxy. My mom said it was okay, so I got up, and one of the workers gave me a tiny palm-sized treasure chest. I was actually really excited. Foxy was my favorite. Me and about 6 other kids were all given small treasures. And that's when Foxy jumped off the pirate cove. He yelled, "It's me, I'm gonna getcha." And that's when we all scrambled. It was great fun. I looked over my shoulder and saw Foxy chasing around the other kids, and at one point, he even almost got me. Boy, Foxy was fast. I didn't quite know why at the time, but while I was in the middle of playing the treasure hunt game, my mom lifted me up abruptly and carried me swiftly toward the exit. She said things like, "We have to go right now, and we should never have come here." I'd never heard such urgency in her voice before. I thought that maybe it was because some kids started crying when Foxy caught them. They had screamed really loud and started sobbing. I remember that a bunch of parents rushed over. There was all sorts of commotion and noise, but I was too busy having fun to notice that anything was wrong. But now that I think of it, I do remember that as my mom carried me through the exit, I saw Foxy standing above the body of the kid he had caught. He was staring right at me, with crimson liquid dripping from his teeth. "It's me, I'm gonna getcha."
Number 5.
I often like to view creepy things on the internet. I don't totally know why. I've just always been intrigued by things that are just off. Any media is fine to take in the content. Stories, movies, videos, audio clips, video games, honestly whatever. I just want to be unnerved. I work third shift, so my sleep schedule is all messed up. I sleep during the day and work at night. I get 2 days off a week, though, and always in a row. I could use this time to have some semblance of a normal life, but I'd rather not have to readjust my sleep schedule once work starts up again, so I just stay up all night and sleep during the day. So, browsing the internet on one of those days off, I came to a thread which had a bunch of links on it. Each comment was just a link. Some of them led to websites about unexplained mysteries, some were streams of horror movies, and others were of accounts of paranormal events which were supposedly true. Then I saw one that was none of the above. I don't remember what the link was. It was just random letters and numbers. It was nonsense. I clicked on it, and it took me to a single page with a single picture, and nothing to click on. It auto full screened and refreshed at random intervals anywhere between roughly 2 and 10 seconds. There was text on top of the picture which read as following. I liked the site already. The picture showed a painting on the wall of a nondescript forest scene. There was a small TV screen centered at the bottom of the picture, an old CRT. On top of the TV was an older looking analog clock with a wood frame and fancy hands. The site continued to refresh, but the picture never changed. Out of sheer curiosity, I didn't leave the page. I kept the tab open and checked back every minute or two. Still, no change. After about 10 minutes, I got tired of missing the refreshes. Maybe it was changing drastically, but only once every minute or so, and I was completely missing it. So I closed all the other tabs to make sure I wouldn't be tempted to leave. I was staring at that picture for what seemed to be an hour. I checked my phone. It had been 26 minutes. I guess time goes slowly when you're just staring at a still image online. I can't say what it is or when it is, but at some point, I noticed that it wasn't just a still image. Well, it was, but the image was changing. The clock, when I first pulled up the page, read about something close to 4:15. Now, it was showing 4:56. The clock had been changing the entire time. I watched it for a full minute, and somewhere among the refreshes, I saw the minute hand change to 57. The time on the clock didn't reflect the real time. Still though, this was dedication. Someone had to take a picture once per minute for an hour, or at least 45 minutes, and then have it change every minute. I kept watching it until it showed 5 o'clock. I expected it to shift back to 4, but it just went to 5:01. That's even more impressive. Maybe it went for a full 12 hours. Someone needs a job. Anyway, now I was hooked. I had to see if it had a full range of times. Now that I knew I didn't have to intently stare at the picture anymore, I was able to shift my focus to the text. It definitely seemed strange. I realized quickly that it was a code of sorts, and it said XIIXIX. I thought about it for a while, but then I realized the colon in the phrase XII:XIX, 1219. I guess I had to wait till 1219 to see what was going to happen. What was so worth all of this work? The next few hours were boring. Once I thought I saw something in the painting, but I'm pretty sure that was just my imagination and my mind wanting to see something. I set all of my clocks in my house to the time on this site, so I'd know where it was, even when I wasn't at my computer. 12 o'clock came, and I was glued to my computer. No getting up, no other tabs. I was just staring, intently, watching the hands on the clock refresh, minute after minute. 12:18, refresh, refresh, refresh. I was certain that this minute had actually taken 4 or 5 minutes to transpire. Finally, 12:19. Nothing. No change in the image, no change to the site. That was disappointing. I figured I'd at least get a message on the site or a different picture or something. Maybe that was the prank. Nothing. The guy who made this would lure people in, give them a simple image to solve just to pique their intrigue, and then disappoint them greatly. Bravo, I thought to myself, or brava. I quickly corrected. I left the site and went back to my day. I couldn't get the site out of my head though. Not even an hour after I left, I had convinced myself that I should go back to see the site. Control-Shift-T. After all, there are 2 12:19s in a day, aren't there? The clock now said 12:48. I looked over at the clock on my desk, and it also said 12:48. The creator must have kept it synced up with their local time or something. I had a nearly 12-hour wait ahead of me now. I could have stayed up all night, but I didn't want to drive myself crazy, so I went to sleep. I didn't sleep well, or for very long, but then again I rarely do. I checked the clock on the desk, which was still set to the website time, and it said 8:52, only a little over 3 hours of a wait from there. I checked the site, and still no change in the image. I did things around the house and online to kill the next few hours. As soon as the clock was near 12 though, I was once again seated firmly in front of my computer screen. The next 18 minutes were agonizing. The last minute was even worse. The hands of the clock once again struck 12:19, and once again, nothing happened. I was distraught. I had invested a lot of time into this. The minute wasn't over though, so I continued to watch. I then heard a click, quiet, but still audible. After that, I noticed that the web page wasn't constantly refreshing anymore. The screen on the TV began to brighten. Finally. What I had waited for was finally happening. As the screen on the TV brightened, I began to be able to make out an image. It was small, because the TV screen on the monitor was only about 2 inches wide. But I could still clearly see that they were showing woods. Maybe it was a forest in the picture. The camera was bobbing up and down as grass and leaves passed by. It must have someone filming themselves walking. The camera was kept pointed at the ground for the first minute or so, but then slowly started to point more horizontally. I could see that they were coming up on a yard. Some houses flashed quickly on the edges of the screen. There was some talking in another language. I couldn't say what the language was, and then clicks and clunks like they were dealing with equipment. The camera made larger movements than before. I realized, as the sounds went away and the image stabilized dramatically, that they had been setting it up on a tripod. Once they got it up, I heard a little more talking, and then the camera made one final turn. During the turn, I could see that it was set up just along the woods. The camera finally stopped shaking, and there was a house centered within the frame. As small as it was, I could tell it was my house. I jumped up from my desk chair, but my eyes kept fixed on the screen. The men abandoned their camera and walked up to the house. Walked up to my house. They stood at the front door for what was probably 20 seconds, but it seemed like 5 minutes. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if there was anything I could do. They knocked on the door. I heard it faintly through my speakers, but it wasn't at the door. Not hearing it within my house calmed me down enough to check the door. Nobody was there. Nobody was in the yard, but I couldn't make anything out past a couple 100 feet. It was dark out, and the moon wasn't very bright. I closed and locked the door, and ran back up to the computer. The screen was still displaying these 2 men standing at the door. They knocked again, but this time harder. I watched as the door opened. A man answered it. I couldn't make him out. I was half expecting it to be me. I was relieved, though, to see it wasn't. I have brown hair, and the man on the screen had red hair. One of the men gestures something to him, and the red-haired man begins to close the door. At this point, the other man shoves the door open again, pulls a gun from his belt, and shoots the man in the head. I felt my face go pale and my jaw fall open. My vision started to go black, but I forced myself to keep my composure. The 2 men ran from the door and toward the camera. In the small TV screen on my monitor, and in the blur of motion, I could still see that both men were smiling, widely. They grabbed the camera, not bothering to take it off the tripod, and ran into the woods again. The camera shiveled on the tripod and showed one of the men's faces, but quite blurrily. He looked at the camera, reached over toward it with his other hand, and the screen on the TV went blank. The page refreshed again, but only once, and the clock still read 12:19. I closed down my browser and even shut down my computer. I ran to the door one last time to see if I could see anything. Once again, there was nobody there. To this day, I have no clue what actually took place. I haven't had the nerve to revisit the website or ask anybody what happened to the people who lived here before I did, and I'm not sure I ever will.
Number 6.
English professors have told me that born writers can sit by a computer and make up a story in an hour, without even having to think. Their stories flow like water from their fingertips. I am most definitely not a born writer. People like me, people without born artistic talent, we need pain to create. We need horrible tragedies to write our stories. This is how we profit. We take our mother's deaths and make the widest selling and most beloved children's books of all time. We need inspiration, and inspiration will only come from pain. I write love stories, heart-wrenching, sob-inducing love stories. A daughter loses her mother, or a young girl and her first heartbreak. That's what I write. Walk in any bookstore, and there you'll see my books, my name larger than the title, and posters with promise of a new book coming out this January. They are all essentially the same plot, yet every single one has been optioned for a movie deal. It doesn't matter. Every teenage girl in this country will go with a box of tissues and proclaim their love for the main male actor. It's obvious that my books aren't interesting, but if I told you how I made them, I know you'd stop and listen. Every girl in my story, she is real, or was real. Every heartbreak was real. Their pain is my sustenance. I find a girl, 20, and cute. She is eager for fun, eager for love. I profess my love for her after a few dates. Boy, do I lay it on thick. I devote myself to her. She thinks she met the perfect guy. I listen to her. I understand her. We talk about our feelings, and we have slow, loving sex. I'm a gay friend who can provide several orgasms per night. Every girl's dream. And when the time is right, I tell her we're going to my special place. I tell her it's the place I promised myself I'd only share with the girl I know I love. We drive. We stop for a bite to eat at whatever her favorite restaurant is along the way. We drive for miles, out of the city and into the woods. She's excited to see what I have planned. It's dusk, and we're in the woods. Appalachia, the mountain air soothing. We hike a bit, and finally, we're at the most beautiful view in Virginia. The town below twinkles as the inhabitants light fires in their houses before night finds them. Mountains rise against the backlit red sky. She tells me how beautiful it is. And I always say, in a moment of wanted cheesiness, just like you. She turns to me, love glowing in her eyes. Naturally, this is when I stab her in the stomach as hard as I can. Again in the chest, then I slash her throat. Her shrill screaming won't travel as far as the town. This is my inspiration. The only time anyone ever feels true heartbreak is when they realize the one they love absolutely hates them. I can see it in their eyes, her sense of heart-wrenching betrayal. She's crying and screaming from the pain of death and the fact that the man she loves wants her dead. I want her dead. So, I look into her eyes. I watch her thrash. I listen to her heart break. This is what makes the written snuff pornography that the teeny bopper girls love so much. I'm home and writing. I need a book by January. I call this one The Trail, the story of a girl who finds her life and love and eventual heartbreak while hiking through the Appalachian Trail. Already, I'm getting movie offers from big shot movie companies. Every day, girls write me letters about how much I inspire them. They have no idea how much they inspire me.
Number 7.
She stalked the dark hallways of the school, making sure that she made no unnecessary sound that would attract anyone. She had been following her math teacher for a few minutes now, and was positive that she had seen him wander into the school building. She checked her watch, She had about an hour to the curfew. The school was deserted, as it had been for the last summer month. She was being extra cautious. She didn't want anyone seeing her follow her teacher into the school. That could only bring trouble. She followed her teacher into the dark hallways. Her teacher seemed to be wandering aimlessly, oblivious to his follower. She waited for him to move into someplace quieter so she could make her move. Her teacher stopped in front of the bathroom, probably intrigued by the sound of rumbling pipes, and slowly made his way inside. Perfect, she muttered to herself as she reached around for her pink backpack and withdrew a bloodied solid lead pipe from within and made her way into the bathroom. She carefully closed the bathroom door behind her and ever so softly turned the lock. The soft clink of the lock made her teacher turn around to face her. She could see the look of confusion in the old man's eyes. She followed his gaze to the lead pipe in her hands and watched as his face contorted into a hideous snarl as she lunged towards her. A smile forming on her lips, she sidestepped and drove the pipe with all her might into the back of his head with a sickening thump. She watched him crash onto the floor. Soon enough, a pool of dark blood formed around his head. She had done this way too often than she'd cared to admit. As her math teacher lay on the white-tiled bathroom floor, twitching uncontrollably from the skull bashing he had just received, she stood over him, her feet on either side of his waist. She looked him right in the eye and said, "This is for the C on my last paper," and drove the pipe into his skull again, finishing him. As she wiped the blood and brains from the lead pipe, the walkie-talkie in her backpack crackled.
Bulldog, this is Base. What's your status? Over.
Base, this is Bulldog. The school is clear. I repeat, the school is clear. Returning to base now. Over and out. As she made her way out of the bathroom, she glanced towards the corpse of her math teacher and muttered to herself, "Man, this zombie apocalypse is stressful."
Number 7.
I sat staring at the computer screen in the blackness of my room. The time in the bottom right-hand corner turned to 11:56 p.m. I knew that in 6 hours, I was going to have to get up and get ready to go back to that hellhole. But I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to do so. The thought of seeing those evil people again frightened me to the bone. I'm not talking about the other students. I mean the teachers. I'm still not sure if I'll be in danger if I go there. Trust me, if you saw what I've seen, you'd understand. Let me tell you exactly how things led to this point. I was a nerd. I was always nice to everybody in the school and nobody had any problems with me. You could actually argue that I was one of the more popular kids. But I simply befriended everyone I could. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Speak ill of no man, but speak all the good you know of everybody." I loved this quote. In fact, I'd even go as far to say that I lived by this quote. It made me feel like a good person, and everybody loved me for it. Everyone in school would always say things like, "Nothing ever happens," or "This place is so boring." But this school was actually pretty eventful. Just in the last 3 weeks of school last year, there had been 3 fights, a prank some seniors pulled where they put loads of dollar store candy in the desks in the school, and even a death on campus. The fights didn't really interest me, and the candy thing was cool. The teachers didn't really have a problem with it, seeing as they didn't break anything when they broke in. How they got in is still a mystery. That only left the death on campus. It was a quiet girl nobody really knew. Her name was Amelia Rose, and she apparently didn't have any friends, and would skip class to hide in some other area of the school. One day, she hid under the metal bleachers and started taking some drugs she found in her parents' pill cabinet. I don't know exactly the kind of drugs she was taking, but there was an allergic reaction, and she was dead by the end of the period. The entire school was torn apart and depressed for an entire week, only to be returned to its usual madness the following Monday. It was rumored that her ghost haunted the school. People even started telling stories of weird things that would happen to them when they were alone. One lacrosse player would tell stories about how the locker doors would mysteriously open and close when he was alone in the room. A kid on the JROTC drill team who came in early before school hours to practice said that when he went upstairs to his locker in the dark, he swore he saw a ghost. And a girl who'd stayed after one day said that when she went to the bathroom, a toilet flushed by itself. She was the only one in the bathroom. Now, I wasn't entirely sure I believed these people myself, but I sure as heck wanted to. The idea of some kind of spirit roaming the halls with us throughout the day fascinated me to no end. On the last day of my psychology class, my teacher asked the class if we wanted to do a seance to try and talk to Amelia and help her move on. Everyone happily agreed, and we all gathered in a circle around the room as Mr. Braun lit candles around. He warned the class to be respectful as he actually believed in what we were doing. When we first started, nothing happened for a while. 10 minutes had gone by before the light bulb on Mr. Braun's lamp exploded. A few people jumped. A deafening silence was followed shortly thereafter. For a second, I thought our teacher was pulling an elaborate joke on us, but when I saw the look of shock scribbled across his middle-aged face, I knew it was not of his doing. We sat in silence for what seemed like an eternity, when our awkward makeshift seance was interrupted by the bell. I was honestly a little disappointed. I really wanted to talk to Amelia. Walking toward the buses, a brilliant idea popped into my head. I could sneak into the school over summer break to contact her. Everyone knew that nobody was in the school over summer break anyway. I wonder what the teachers do over summer break, I thought to myself. The thought quickly left my mind as I started imagining if I'd be able to make contact with Amelia. After plenty of internet browsing and planning, I had everything I was going to need before the first week of summer was over. I told my parents I was going to one of my friends' houses and rode my bike the 2 miles to my school. When I got there, I instantly felt like running, but I had gone through too much crap to just turn around now. I looked around for an open window or something, but to no avail. I started worrying I wasn't going to be able to get in, and part of me was a little happy about it. I told myself that I was going to try the seldom used back door to see if it was unlocked, and if not, I was just gonna head home. I walked over to the rusted brown door and pushed. I was completely awestruck. It was open. I slowly entered the large, seemingly empty building. Walking down the halls, I couldn't help but think to myself that this didn't feel like the school I'd come to know. It felt like a whole different place not during regular school hours. I walked around trying to decide where to set up my little ritual area when I noticed something out of place. The door leading to the basement was wide open. Without thinking, I slowly made my way down the stairs. I could hear some kind of chanting. It made me feel really uneasy, but curiosity trumped fear, and I continued on. What I saw chilled me to the bone. I saw 5 teachers. They were all wearing black robes and standing around the bloodied corpse of Amelia Rose. I pinched myself to see if I was dreaming, only to realize this was no dream. I can't describe in words how terrified I was when they all started walking toward me without saying a word. I feared for my life. I sprinted the hell out of that school and pedaled my bike as fast as it would go. I spent the remainder of the summer trying to play video games and forgetting about the whole ordeal, but I just couldn't. The worst part was that I couldn't even tell anyone about it. That's why I'm writing this, in hopes that someone, somewhere out there, will believe me.
Number 9.
It had been a long, tiring day at work. It was quiet as I waited alone for the train. It was a bit after midnight, and so dark that I could only see the square foot around me that the small light illuminated. Fortunately, I wasn't stuck waiting long for the train. Eagerly, I ran in the second the doors opened. There were only 2 other men in the compartment. Not unusual for this time of night. The place reeked of smoke from the older man huffing on a cigarette. He took another long drag of it and watched me as I came in and took my seat. I sat and looked up at the other man, sitting across from the smoker. He was only about 5 seats away, but his face was hidden by his hood, so I had trouble making out his features. His eyes, though. One was normal, but the other was red, where it should be white. He stared shamelessly back at me, with a tight, almost pained expression. I smiled at him, trying to break the tension, but he just stared. I looked out the window, trying to ignore his gaze, but I could still feel his eyes on me. The train lights began to flicker and went out for a moment. "Sorry, folks," said a voice over the static of the PA. "We're gonna get maintenance on that in the morning. We apologize for any inconvenience." My stomach dropped, and I struggled to control my breathing. I reminded myself that there was no reason to be afraid of the dark. That I was a grown man, a tax-paying adult, who, thank God, the lights were back. I hadn't even realized my eyes were squeezed shut. Sighing, I opened them to see the man's unsettling eye staring directly into mine from only 2 seats away. Bewildered, I looked over at the older man, who hadn't moved from his seat. He took another drag from his cigarette and coughed, acting like nothing had happened. The train rumbled down the tracks. I was afraid to look back at the red-eyed man. I didn't want to. I didn't want to move, or even breathe. I tried to convince myself that the whole thing was in my mind. Maybe I was just tired from a long day of work. Maybe I was just paranoid, and he wasn't even looking at me. The lights flickered and went out again. I held my breath, waiting for the lights to come back. After a moment, they did, and he was in the seat next to me, his face only a few inches away from mine. I leaned back. "What the hell, man? What do you think you're doing?" He didn't respond. Instead, the smoker angrily said, "Look, kid, if you wanted me to put out the cigarette, you just had to ask nice, okay?" "Not you. This asshole over here." The smoker stared at me for a second, confused. "It's just me and you's here, kid. You alright?" The red-eyed man hadn't moved or responded at all. The lights went out again.
Number 10.
For the past 4 years, I've worked as a video editor at a woman's apparel company. As you might imagine, most of the employees are female, and I'm in fact the only guy in my department. This leads to a lot of jokes and harmless teasing from both friends and coworkers, but the truth is that I don't mind at all. I hardly even notice. There is, however, one downside. The bathroom situation, but I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. A few months ago, due to lack of space, my employer moved my entire department, about 12 of us, from its main headquarters to a small building across the street. It was a perfect situation. We desperately needed the extra space and the building was available. Unfortunately, it wasn't in great shape. No one had leased the building for quite a while, and it was obvious. Ceiling tiles were cracked or collapsing, the carpets had peeled up, revealing bare concrete underneath, and the bathrooms were in god-awful shape. Honestly, the space looked more like a home for squatters than a comfortable workspace. But my employer put a lot of money into remodeling it, and by the end, it was unrecognizable. What an amazing transformation. We each had individual working spaces complete with potted plants, ergonomic chairs, and open spaces to decorate however we wished. We were given a full kitchen complete with a Kroger coffee maker, magic bullet juicer, and top-of-the-line water purifier. And the girls were given an extravagant bathroom complete with futons and makeup mirrors, you know, the kind with bulbs around the frame. But there was one cost-cutting measure the company implemented, and they did it in the one place where it would affect the least amount of employees: the men's room. The men's room was a single toilet, sink, and plain mirror. That was fine, seeing as I would be the only one using it, aside from the occasional office visitor, but the problem was that the door had a loose lock. Sometimes when I exited the bathroom, the weighted door would shut on its own and randomly engage its mechanism, locking me out until someone from maintenance could come over and jimmy the door back open. It didn't happen that often, but it was often enough to be a huge pain. To make matters worse, sometimes maintenance was bombarded with other matters, leaving me without a bathroom for hours or even days. Luckily, my female coworkers were good-natured enough to let me use the ladies' room if I were ever in the unfortunate situation of having to go badly while locked out of the men's room. They said they didn't mind. If anything, they found it amusing. On the handful of times it happened, I would play it off lightheartedly, though, really, I hated it. And it wasn't just because of my male ego. It wasn't due to indignity or embarrassment. It was because using the ladies' room just felt weird. Like, weird in a creepy way that I can't really explain. As if when I was in there, I wasn't alone. I vividly remember the first time I ever had to resort to using it. It was on one of those days where the men's room lock had jammed that morning, and I had gone nearly a whole day without another bathroom break. An hour before my shift ended, I felt like my bladder was about to burst. My leg was shaking, my teeth were biting the inside of my cheeks, and my eyes were beginning to water. I realized at that point that my options were to either use the ladies' room or find a bush outside. I opted to use the ladies' room, though it was actually a tough decision. My female coworkers promised they would guard the door to make sure no one went in while I used the restroom. They checked to make sure it was empty before I shamefully entered. "Hello?" I said. No response. My first thought was how nice it looked. Like I said before, futons and lit mirrors. I was also surprised that there were no urinals, only stalls. I know that sounds completely crazy, but when you've gone your whole life seeing urinals on the walls of public bathrooms, you do a double take when you realize they aren't there. I entered a stall, locked it, though I was sure no one else would be coming in, and undid my fly. I stood there in heaven as I emptied my bladder, immediately hearing nothing but the sound of rushing pee. This sound continued for what damn near felt like a minute straight before I heard something else. It was the sound of light footsteps. Then, a squeak. My heart stopped. It was the sound of a nearby stall opening. Someone else was in the bathroom with me. Either they had come in unbeknownst to myself and my coworkers, or they had been there all along and hadn't answered when I called out. After the immediate shock, my feeling was that of utter embarrassment. Here I was, standing in the ladies' room, unleashing a floodgate of piss, and some poor girl had to hear it. Some girl I worked with, and who was probably just as embarrassed as I was. Damn, this was awkward. Somehow, without even thinking, I let out a feeble, sorry. I again heard the squeak of a bathroom stall, followed by a light thud. I finished peeing, shook twice for good measure, and sighed deeply as I exited the stall. I saw my beet red face in the light of the mirror as I quickly washed my hands and exited the room. My coworkers swore that no one had entered the ladies' room while I was inside, and they assured me it had been empty when I went in. I wasn't sure, but I chalked it up to me hearing things, perhaps water running through pipes in the wall, and I had forgotten about the whole experience shortly thereafter. I only had to ever resort to using the ladies' room once or twice in the months that followed, and each time was a miserable experience. Each time I was on edge, always paranoid, always feeling as though I was invading someone's space. Once, while washing my hands in the sink, I looked up at the mirror and swore I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a quick motion near one of the stall doors, like someone or something quickly ducking out of sight. I couldn't pinpoint where the motion had come from exactly, but I swore at the moment I saw it. I heard that unmistakable sound, the squeak, followed by a light thud. No wonder women go to the restroom together, I thought. It must help block out all the weird sounds. All in all, using the ladies' restroom was an, at best, awkward experience, but it wasn't too terrible. Until today. Shit, I seriously got a cold chill up my spine thinking about it. Today was the last day that I will ever use the ladies' restroom. And I'll make sure that none of my other coworkers use it again either, if I can help it. It had been a normal day, if not hectic. So much to do, a late lunch which I worked most of my way through. I didn't eat that much as my stomach had been feeling funny all day. I had a million upcoming deadlines to think about as I left the men's restroom around noonish. It shut. It latched. I sighed, turned around and checked the handle, and wasn't that surprised to learn that I had just locked myself out. I sent an email to maintenance and went on with the rest of my day, not thinking much about it. I soon realized that there was no way I'd make it home on time, especially when a last-minute project popped up an hour before I was supposed to leave. I felt a slight worry in my system. First, if I got home late, I may not be able to find a parking spot on my block. Second, I was dealing with quite a bit of indigestion and was feeling quite uncomfortable, but I worked as quickly as I could, hoping I could get out on time. Of course, the days you want to get home early are the days you end up working the latest. Sure enough, by 6 p.m. the last girl had left the office, and I wasn't nearly finished with my project. By 7:30 p.m., my stomach was killing me. It began to loudly rumble, and it wasn't an "I'm hungry" rumble, but rather an "I'm upset and bloated, and you're about to have a mess" kind of rumble. Sparing you too many details, let's just say I needed to use the restroom, and use it badly. I looked at how much longer it would take my computer to finish processing my video project. 45 minutes. That, plus the half-hour drive home, meant there was no way I could wait. I went to the men's room and tried to open it. Click. Alright. It was still locked and maintenance had been too busy to fix it. I looked at the ladies' room and felt a twinge of nervousness for some weird reason, but shook it off and decided to head on in, though the way my stomach was acting, I really didn't have a choice. I entered the ladies' room and quickly rushed to a stall, unbuckling my belt as I walked. Again, I'll try sparing you the details, but within 20 seconds of sitting down, I felt a twinge of horror. I began to hear footsteps. I listened closely, wondering if I was imagining things. Thump, thump, thump. No, it was unmistakable. I was definitely hearing a walking sound. Wait, not a walking sound. A crawling sound. My heart skipped a beat and my lungs turned to iron as I realized where the sound was coming from. It was coming from above me. Directly above me. I looked up and the sound disappeared. For a moment, I heard nothing but the heavy ache of my own racing heartbeat. Then, squeak. It was at that moment I realized I wasn't hearing a stall opening. It was the sound of a ceiling tile lifting, as the tile directly above me slid open ever so slightly. I know I saw it. My eyes widened and my mouth dropped open as I stared at something that was staring back at me. Inside the ceiling, partially hidden in shadow, I saw one eye, peeping around, staring right at me for a single instant. Then, as quickly as it was there, it was gone. The last thing I remember hearing was the light thud of the ceiling tile dropping into place. What happened next is a complete blur. I don't remember standing or even pulling up my pants. I don't remember grabbing my keys, nor exiting the building. I just remember the pounding in my chest, a pounding so hard that my ribs ached. As I drove home, replaying the events in my head, I wondered how the hell I was going to tell my all but one female's apartment what I saw. It was a man's face, but not entirely human.